The silver Mercedes glided down the empty country road just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a wash of orange and gold. Inside, Claire Donovan, elegant, polished, and poised, barely noticed the beauty outside her tinted windows. Her mind was on her next gala, her diamond bracelet glittering as she adjusted the radio. Then in a split second, her life changed forever. Out of nowhere, a dark figure darted onto the road. A screech of tires, a thud. The sound that followed wasn't metal. It was alive. Claire's heart stopped. She slammed the brakes, her breath catching in her throat. When the car finally skidded to a halt, silence hung heavy in the air, until a low, broken whimper sliced through it. She stepped out slowly, her heels clicking against the asphalt. Her stomach twisted when her headlights illuminated a German shepherd lying motionless on the road. His fur was matted with dust, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were open, and they weren't angry, they were pleading. Claire knelt down beside the dog, panic flooding her chest. "Oh my God, oh no," she whispered, her voice trembling as she took in the sight before her. Her elegant silk dress brushed against the rough pavement, instantly ruined, but she didn't care. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The car's headlights illuminated the dog's trembling body, his fur matted with dust and blood, his breathing shallow yet determined. She reached out carefully, her diamond bracelet catching the faint beam of light as her fingers gently touched his paw. The German shepherd flinched, his muscles twitching in pain, but he didn't growl. There was no anger, no fear, only something deeper, desperate. Then with a low whimper, he tried to move. He dug his paws into the ground, dragging himself weakly forward. Claire froze, confused. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't afraid of her. He was moving toward something, his eyes fixed on a dark patch of overgrown grass just off the road. "What are you doing?" Claire murmured softly, as if speaking to a wounded child. She followed his gaze, but the shadows were too thick to see what lay beyond. The dog's determination was unshakable. Despite the pain that made his entire body tremble, he kept pushing, inch by inch, his claws scraping against the gravel, his breathing uneven and strained. It was as if his entire being was focused on one thing, and Claire, though she didn't understand, couldn't help but follow. She crouched lower, the smell of dirt and rain filling her senses as she moved closer to the edge of the road. The grass was tall, unkempt, and glistening faintly under the headlights. Her heels sank into the mud as she parted the blades with her hands. Just a few feet away, something caught her eye, an old, weather-worn cardboard box half hidden beneath a bush. Its edges were soaked and collapsing inward, its surface stained with dirt and leaves. The dog stopped beside it, his entire body trembling with exhaustion. He rested his head on the box, letting out a low, heart-wrenching cry that seemed to echo through the still night air. Claire's stomach tightened. She looked from the dog to the box, her breath shallow. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly leaned over and lifted one of the flaps. Her hand froze mid-air as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Inside, huddled together, were two tiny puppies, so small they could fit in her hands. Their fur was damp, their little bodies shivering uncontrollably, and their faint whimpers pierced the silence. One tried to nuzzle deeper into the corner of the box, seeking warmth that wasn't there. Claire's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. The realization hit her like a wave. This dog, this injured, bleeding creature, had been trying to protect them. The German shepherd lifted his head weakly and looked at her, his eyes glassy but calm. Then, as if to reassure her, he wagged his tail once, just once, a faint and fragile gesture that broke her completely. It was as if he was saying, "See? They're safe now." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Pure, unfiltered compassion. The sight of the dog, battered and broken yet still driven by love, shattered the cold shell she'd built around herself. She reached out again, running her trembling hand gently over his head. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were just trying to save them." The dog closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but peaceful, as if her words were enough to let him rest. Claire looked back at the tiny puppies, their fragile lives trembling in that flimsy box, and something inside her changed forever. Over the next few days, Claire visited the clinic every single morning without fail. It didn't matter if it was raining or if her calendar was stacked with meetings, she was there. Always at the same time, always carrying something new for Max and the puppies. The clinic staff had grown used to the sight of her sleek black car pulling into the gravel parking lot. the elegant woman stepping out, her heels clicking softly as she carried in blankets, fresh dog food, and little toys she'd bought from the pet store the night before. The nurses would exchange glances, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day that a woman like Claire Donovan, the Claire Donovan, graced their humble clinic. She was known in the nearby town for her wealth and her aloofness. People often said she lived in a house too big for one person and had a heart too small to share it. But here, in the fluorescent-lit hallway of a modest animal clinic, that same woman knelt on the cold tile floor every day, whispering softly to a dog who'd once been half dead on a roadside. Max, that's what Dr. Adam Heller had started calling him, was improving. The deep cuts on his flank were healing and the stiffness in his back legs had lessened. Every time Claire walked in, his ears would twitch first, then his eyes would find her and his tail would start to thump weakly against the bedding. The sound was faint but steady, the kind of sound that said, "I remember you." "You came back?" Claire smiled each time. She'd crouch beside his bed, her perfume mixing faintly with the antiseptic air. "You're a hero, you know that?" She whispered one morning, stroking his head gently. "You saved them. You saved your babies." Max blinked slowly, pressing his head against her hand. His breath was warm, soft. She could almost feel gratitude in the weight of his gaze. It made her heart ache. Not in a painful way, but in a way that reminded her she still had one. Adam leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching them. There was something quietly moving about the sight. This refined woman, dressed in pearls and silk, talking to a dog as if he were an old friend. When she finally looked up, she caught him smiling. "What?" she asked, a hint of a laugh in her voice. Adam shook his head. "He probably saved more than them," he said softly. Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment before replying. "You look like someone who's been running from her heart for a long time." The words hit her harder than she expected. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. She didn't have a clever answer. No witty deflection. For a moment, all she could do was stare at him, then look back down at Max, who was watching her with the kind of quiet understanding only animals possess. "I should get going," she said finally, her voice low. Adam nodded with a small, knowing smile. "He'll be waiting for you tomorrow." That night, Claire drove home in silence. The engine purred smoothly. The leather interior smelled of luxury, but the car felt unbearably empty. Her reflection in the window seemed like that of a stranger, polished, perfect, and hollow. Outside, the town lights faded into the darkness of the countryside, and she found herself thinking about Max lying in that clinic, his tail wagging at the sound of her voice. How could a creature so broken still have room for love? When she reached her mansion, the gate slid open automatically. The house loomed ahead, a masterpiece of architecture. Tall glass windows, modern sculptures, and silence. Always silence. The sound of her heels echoed across the marble floor as she walked inside, but even that seemed to disappear too quickly. She passed her dining table, where a meal for one sat untouched, and her living room, where the fireplace burned only for decoration. For the first time, the emptiness suffocated her. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her evening dress, and whispered to herself, "He was just trying to save them." She thought of his eyes, how they looked at her not with hatred but trust. How he still wagged his tail even after she'd been the one to hurt him. It made her chest tighten until she pressed her hands to her heart just to feel something. The next morning, before sunrise, Claire was already awake. She dressed simply this time. Jeans, a sweater, no jewelry. She looked at herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Then she picked up a small bag and drove straight to the clinic. When she walked in, the staff greeted her with warm smiles. "He's been waiting for you," one of the nurses said. Claire smiled faintly. "I brought him something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a collar, soft brown leather, simple but beautiful, with a small silver tag that gleamed under the lights. Engraved on it was one word, Max. When she stepped into the recovery room, Max's ears immediately perked up. His tail began to wag, and with a burst of strength that surprised even the vet tech nearby, he pushed himself to his feet. He took a few unsteady steps toward her, his nails clicking against the floor, then pressed his head into her hand. Claire laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes. "You remember me, don't you?" she whispered. Max licked her hand once, then looked up at her with those warm amber eyes that seemed to hold the whole world. She knelt down and slipped the collar around his neck. "There," she said gently. "Now you're really mine." From that day on, she was there for everything. Every meal, every walk, every bark that echoed through the clinic halls. She'd sit beside his bed reading softly from her phone, or just talking about her day as if he understood every word. Sometimes she'd stay until closing time, helping feed the puppies or clean their little basket. Adam often found himself watching from afar, quietly impressed. There was something profoundly human about what was unfolding between them, a healing that went both ways. Max grew stronger, yes, but so did Claire. The sadness that used to hang behind her polished smile was fading, replaced by warmth. One evening, as she sat beside Max while the puppies slept in their basket, Adam approached with a cup of coffee. "You know," he said with a grin, "I think he's training you just as much as you're helping him." Claire chuckled. "Maybe I needed it." Adam tilted his head. "We all need someone who reminds us to care even when it hurts." She looked down at Max, who was resting his chin on her knee, eyes half closed in contentment. "He doesn't ask for anything," she whispered. "Just love." Adam nodded. "That's what makes it pure." That night, when she finally left the clinic, the air felt different. Softer. Warmer. She could hear crickets chirping in the distance, the wind brushing through the trees. And for the first time in years, Claire felt something she hadn't known she'd lost. Peace. Back in her car, she glanced at the small paw prints on her sleeve and smiled. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like calm, the kind that only comes after finding something worth holding on to. She whispered to herself as if speaking to the night, "You saved more than your puppies, Max. You saved me too." And from then on, she was there not because she felt guilty, but because she couldn't imagine a morning without seeing him. 2 weeks later, Max was finally strong enough to leave the clinic. His coat had regained its shine. His wounds had healed into faint scars, and his eyes were bright with life again. Claire stood beside him as Adam finalized the paperwork, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and emotion. The puppies, tiny bundles of fur now tumbling over one another playfully, were yipping softly in their crate. When Adam slid the last form across the counter, Claire didn't hesitate. She signed her name with a smile, the kind that came not from habit but from the heart. "They're family now," she said softly, her hand brushing over Max's head. Adam nodded approvingly. "He's lucky to have you, Claire. But if I had to guess," he added with a grin, "you're the lucky one." That evening, as twilight painted the world in hues of gold and lavender, Claire decided to take Max and the puppies for a short drive. There was something unfinished in her heart, a feeling that tugged at her whenever she thought of that lonely stretch of road where it had all begun. She wanted to face it again, not with guilt or fear, but with understanding. Maybe, she thought, she owed it to Max to go back, to close the circle. The Mercedes purred down the same winding road, though this time the air felt different. The windows were rolled down and the soft wind carried the scent of earth and grass. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. In the back, the puppies nestled in a soft blanket, their tiny faces pressed against the glass as the scenery passed by. When Claire finally slowed and pulled over, the last light of day kissed the fields in soft pastels. She turned off the engine, and for a moment there was only silence, the peaceful kind that comes after storms. Max jumped out the moment she opened the door, landing gracefully on the dirt, his tail wagging. The puppies tumbled after him, clumsy but excited, chasing one another through the tall grass. Claire leaned against the car, watching them, her heart full. "You're free now, Max," she whispered to herself. Then after a pause, she said aloud, "I'm sorry, you know. If I could take that moment back, I would. But maybe—" She looked out over the horizon where the sun melted into orange and pink. Maybe it was meant to happen. As if understanding, Max turned toward her, his ears twitching. For a brief moment, his gaze softened. Then, without warning, his body stiffened. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes focused on the line of trees beyond the field. "What is it?" Claire asked, her pulse quickening. Max gave a single sharp bark, low and commanding, then sprinted across the field with surprising speed. Claire's breath caught. "Max, wait!" she called, stumbling after him as the puppies yipped in confusion. Her heels sank into the damp soil, but she kept going, following the sound of Max's bark as it echoed through the quiet evening. She found him standing at the edge of a small clearing near a collapsed wooden fence. The old boards were half buried under grass and wildflowers. the ground disturbed by years of wind and rain. And there, beneath the fence, lay something that made her heart stop, a small handmade wooden cross. It was weathered, the wood cracked and faded, but still upright. A piece of old cloth fluttered weakly around its base. Claire's hands shook as she approached, the inscription barely visible in the dying light. For Daisy, loyal friend. Her breath caught in her throat. The name, the simplicity, the love behind it. Tears welled in her eyes as realization dawned. This was where Max's mate had died. Daisy, the mother of the two puppies, the one he'd been guarding when Claire first found him. He hadn't just been protecting his babies that night. He had been standing watch over the grave of the one he'd loved and lost. Claire dropped to her knees beside the cross, her hand trembling as she brushed away the dirt. The wood felt rough under her fingers, yet sacred. She looked up at Max, who stood beside her, his head bowed low, his tail still. He pressed his body against her shoulder, and she could hear his soft, broken whine. "Oh, Max," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were protecting her, and them, all this time." Her tears spilled freely now, tracing down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. The field was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs and the gentle rustle of wind through the grass. Above them, the sky deepened into twilight, streaks of violet and amber fading into night. In that sacred stillness, something shifted inside Claire. She understood now the courage, the love, the unspoken loyalty that had driven Max. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a guardian, a soul who refused to leave behind what mattered most. And kneeling beside him, she realized that love like his, pure, selfless, eternal, was the kind of love she'd been missing her whole life. From that day forward, Claire's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The woman who once spent her evenings at grand parties surrounded by people who admired her wealth but never really knew her, now found herself happiest in the quiet company of 3 dogs. The mansion that had once felt like a hollow monument to success slowly became a home. The echo of her footsteps on the marble floors was replaced by the joyful scampering of paws, the jingle of collars, and the sound of laughter that came from somewhere deep within her chest, a sound she hadn't heard in years. She stopped caring about the things that used to define her. The dresses hanging in her closet gathered dust, the jewelry boxes remained unopened, and the invitations to charity galas went unanswered. Instead, her days were spent taking long walks with Max, watching Bella and Scout chase butterflies through the garden, and tending to the flowers she'd planted near the fountain in her backyard. Where once there had been silence, there was now life. Max followed her everywhere, his loyalty as steadfast as the day she met him. In the mornings, he'd wait by the kitchen door, tail thumping softly against the floor as she poured her coffee. In the afternoons, he'd stretch out beside her in the garden, his head resting on her lap as she read or tended to her roses. In the evenings, he'd curl up by the fireplace while Bella and Scout wrestled playfully beside him. Sometimes, when the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, Claire would look at them all and feel her chest tighten with gratitude. "You saved me too," she often whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek before anyone, even them, could notice. Her staff had noticed the change as well. The housekeeper, Mrs. Turner, who had worked for Claire for over a decade, once remarked softly, "It's nice to see you smile again." "Ma'am," Claire had simply smiled back, realizing that it was true. For the first time in years, her smiles were real. As the months passed, the bond between Claire and Max deepened. He was more than a pet. He was a companion, a protector, a living reminder that love could come from the most unexpected places. The puppies, Bella and Scout, grew quickly, playful, mischievous, full of life. They filled the home with chaos, knocking over vases, stealing slippers, and turning the garden into their personal playground. But instead of frustration, Claire found herself laughing, truly laughing one each time. Every mess, every muddy paw print was proof of a life well lived. Then, one golden afternoon months later, Claire decided to return to the place where everything had begun. She dressed simply onto light sweater, jeans, and a pair of boots. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from her own garden. Max trotted beside her, his fur glistening in the sunlight, while Bella and Scout followed close behind. When they reached that familiar stretch of country road, Claire parked the car and stepped out slowly. The air was cool and still, filled with the faint hum of cicadas and the scent of blooming grass. She walked through the field until she came to the small wooden cross that marked Daisy's resting place. Time had weathered it, but the inscription was still legible. Claire knelt down, brushing a few fallen leaves away before laying the bouquet at its base. Her fingers lingered on the cross, tracing the carved letters with tenderness. Tears glistened in her eyes, not from grief this time, but from a deep, quiet peace. "I think Daisy would be proud," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but there was warmth in it. Max stood beside her, his tail wagging gently, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he too remembered. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers. Claire took a deep breath and looked up at the sky, painted in soft shades of orange and pink. She smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "for showing me what love looks like." As the sun dipped lower, Max pressed his head against her shoulder, Bella and Scout nestling at her side. Together they stood there, a family born from tragedy, bound by love and healed by forgiveness. The world around them felt still, timeless, as if the moment itself knew it was sacred. And in that gentle silence, Claire knew that Daisy's spirit lived on, not just in Max, but in every heartbeat, every wagging tail, and every act of love that had saved them all. As the sun dipped low and the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, Claire smiled through her tears. Sometimes fate has a strange way of breaking you just to open your heart again. A dog she once hurt had taught her what love, loyalty, and forgiveness truly meant. She whispered, "Thank you, Max, for showing me what it means to care." The camera would fade on the image of Claire kneeling beside Max and his puppies under the orange sky, an image of redemption, grace, and unexpected love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.